Settlers are beating my mom for being Chinese. Please save her. But Rancher took off all her clothes and was shocked by what he saw. What do you do when a hate-filled mob is beating a woman for the crime of her heritage, and her terrified child can only watch? You expect a hero to draw a gun. But when a silent, weathered rancher finally steps in, he does the last thing anyone expects. He begins to remove her tattered clothes, and the scar he finds underneath doesn't just shock him, it exposes a shared, violent past that will force him to drown the entire world in blood and water to protect them. The wind was a bully, kicking up dust and grit, stealing my mother's gasps of pain and flinging them into the vast, uncaring emptiness of the Badlands. Her name was Liane, and her attackers hated her for the beautiful almond shape of her eyes, for the quiet dignity she held even as their fists fell. Their laughter was dry and cracked like the parched earth beneath our feet, a chorus of cruelty under the oppressive, brassy sun. I was a statue carved from fear, my own cries trapped in my throat, my small hands clenched into useless fists. They were a faceless mob, their features blurred by a shared, ugly prejudice, their voices a constant drone of insults that poisoned the air. A single, dark flower of blood bloomed on my mother's cheek, stark against her pale skin. Just as their boots drew back for another kick, a new sound cut through the wind, the slow, rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the heavy, deliberate tread of a lone horse. A man appeared on the ridge, a dark silhouette against the glaring sky, so still he seemed a part of the landscape itself. He dismounted, his movements unhurried, wrapping the reins around a dead sagebrush. He walked towards the group, and his silence was a physical force, a sudden drop in pressure that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. The taunts died in their throats. Their fists lowered. The mob instinctively shuffled back, their cowardly bravado withering under the weight of his gaze, which was hidden in the deep shadow of his hat's brim. He didn't acknowledge them. He walked through their midst as if they were ghosts, his path unwavering, and knelt in the dust beside my mother's crumpled form. His shadow was a sudden, cool reprieve from the relentless sun. I watched, my heart a terrified bird beating against my ribs, as a large, calloused hand reached out. But it didn't go for a weapon. With a strange, almost hesitant gentleness, he began to work at the knot of her torn shawl, intending to cover her shivering shoulders with his own thick duster. As the ruined fabric fell away from her back, he froze. His entire body went rigid, a man turned to stone. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a noise of pure, unearthed shock. There, etched across her shoulder blade, was a scar I knew as well as my own reflection, 3 long, parallel lines, puckered and white with age, cutting across a much older, smaller burn mark beneath them. It was the claw of a great cat. And it was the exact mirror of the scar hidden beneath his own dusty shirt, a mark from a day of fire and screaming that he thought he alone had survived. The world stopped. He wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a victim. They were the last 2 ghosts of the same massacre. The journey to his ranch was a blur of motion and suffocating silence, a desperate retreat from the stunned and hateful eyes of the mob. The man, this silent protector, had lifted my mother onto his horse with an ease that belied her dead weight, his powerful arms a cradle of surprising tenderness. He had then lifted me, placing me in the saddle in front of her, before taking the reins and leading us away, his back a rigid wall of defiance against the threats that were once again finding their voice behind us. He never looked back, his long, steady strides eating up the dusty ground, pulling us deeper into a landscape of cracked earth and twisted, skeletal trees. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer, but the man seemed immune to it, a creature born of this harsh, unforgiving land. His ranch was not a place of comfort, it was an outpost, a last stand against the wilderness. It was a small, solid cabin built of sun-bleached timber and river stones, hunkered down in the curve of a dry canyon, as if seeking shelter from the vast, empty sky. Inside, the oppressive heat lessened to a bearable warmth. The air smelled of dry wood, leather, and the faint, metallic scent of loneliness. He eased my mother onto a simple cot, the only real piece of furniture in the sparse, single room. His movements were deft and sure, stripped of all wasted effort. He moved with the quiet competence of a man long accustomed to solitude and survival. He brought a basin of water from a barrel in the corner, the liquid precious and cool. He lit no lamp, the bright afternoon light slanting through the single dusty window providing all the illumination he needed. His face, fully seen for the first time, was a map of hardship, carved by wind and sun, with eyes the color of a faded blue sky, holding a history of sorrows. He began to clean my mother's wounds, and as he rolled up his sleeves, I saw it again, this time on his own flesh, the same terrifying and familiar pattern of 3 long, pale scars wrapping around his forearm. A cougar's greeting. He worked with a focused intensity, his rough-looking hand surprisingly gentle as he cleansed the cuts and applied a strong-smelling salve from a clay pot. I huddled on a stool near the cold stone hearth, a small, silent observer wrapped in the overwhelming presence of this man's quiet world. The only sounds were the soft splash of water, the whisper of the wind around the corners of the cabin, and the heavy, rhythmic beat of my own heart. This small, fortified space, nestled in the heart of nowhere, felt both like a cage and the first safe place I had known in a very long time. My mother, Leanne, drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark body of water. Her first breath was a sharp, pained intake of air, her dark eyes fluttering open to the unfamiliar patterns of light and shadow on the rough-hewn ceiling. She saw me first, and a flicker of relief crossed her face, quickly followed by a wave of confusion as she took in the strange, rustic room. Her gaze then found the man, who was sitting at a small table, sharpening a large knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic sheeing of steel on stone the only sound. He stopped when he felt her eyes on him. He laid the knife down and stood, picking up a cup of water and bringing it to her. He did not speak. He simply offered it. Their eyes locked over the rim of the tin cup, a silent, charged exchange filled with a decade of unspoken history. She looked from his scarred face to the matching scars on his arm, and a dawning, horrified recognition filled her eyes. It was a ghost looking at a ghost. My own voice, small and thin, broke the spell. Why? The single word was a tiny pebble dropped into a deep well of silence. Why did you bring us here? The man turned his head, his pale eyes fixing on me. They were not unkind, but they held a weariness that seemed as old as the canyons themselves. He looked back at my mother, who was now sitting up, her gaze locked on the 3 white lines on his forearm. He didn't answer me with words. He simply touched his own scar, then looked pointedly at the one peeking from the collar of my mother's torn dress. It was an answer more complete than any sentence. A shared wound. A common nightmare. Leanne finally drank, her hand shaking so much he had to steady the cup for her. After a long, tense silence, broken only by the mournful cry of a distant hawk, she spoke, her voice a raw whisper. The wagon train, she said, her eyes seeing not the cabin walls but a scene of fire and death from long ago. The attack at Red Creek Pass. I thought everyone. She trailed off, unable to finish. The man's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He had thought the same thing. I was a boy, he said, his voice a gravelly rumble, rough from disuse. Hiding under the wagon. I saw the cat. I saw you fall. He offered no more, his story ending as abruptly as it began. He had carried that memory, the memory of a woman with a baby falling under the claws of a great cat, for his entire life, believing he was the sole survivor of the slaughter that followed. The fire in the hearth remained cold, but a different kind of warmth began to tentatively fill the space between them, the fragile, painful warmth of a shared trauma, a bond forged in the crucible of a forgotten tragedy. I looked between them, this silent, scarred man and my resilient mother, 2 halves of a terrible memory, unexpectedly reunited in the middle of a new one. A new question began to form in my heart, a fragile bud of hope in the desolate landscape of my fear. Could this place, this man, finally keep us safe? The world outside the canyon walls ceased to exist for a time. We were suspended in a strange limbo, a quiet pocket of existence governed by the rising and setting of the sun. In this isolation, a tentative, unspoken routine began to weave our 3 lives together. We learned his name was Abner, a name as solid and unadorned as the man himself. His life was a testament to discipline and hard-won survival. He rose before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards the first sound of the day. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life where every ounce of energy was precious. he tended to a few tough-looking goats, repaired harnesses with practiced skill, and worked a small, irrigated patch of stubborn vegetables, wresting life from the unforgiving soil. He was a man in constant, silent conversation with his harsh environment. Lian, my mother, began to mend, her quiet strength a powerful force in the small cabin. As she healed, she began to reclaim her space in the world, starting with Abner's starkly masculine dwelling. She found a stash of old flour sacks and, with a needle and thread discovered in a forgotten chest, began sewing curtains for the single window. She took the tough goat meat and bitter roots he subsisted on and, with the addition of a few hoarded spices from her own small bundle, created meals that filled the cabin with aromas of a life beyond mere survival. She would often hum as she worked, soft, haunting melodies from her homeland, the notes a gentle counterpoint to the ever-present whisper of the wind outside. I became the silent observer, the quiet link between their two solitary worlds. I would follow Abner on his chores, watching as his scarred, capable hands mended a fence or calmed a nervous goat. I would sit beside Lian as she ground corn, her movements graceful and rhythmic. A sense of permanence began to settle over me, a feeling of roots tentatively taking hold in the rocky soil. One sweltering afternoon, finding a piece of smooth, flat river stone and a chunk of charcoal from the hearth, I began to draw. I sketched the canyon, the goats, Abner's horse. Then, I drew the three of us, standing in front of the cabin. A stick-figure family. When Abner came in for the midday meal, his face streaked with dust and sweat, I held the stone out to him. He stopped in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light. He took the stone from me, his thumb rough against my skin. He looked at the crude drawing for a long time, his expression unreadable. I saw him swallow a hard bob of his Adam's apple. He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile. He simply walked over to the small, hand-carved mantelpiece above the hearth and placed the stone there, propped up for all to see. It was a silent acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance. For the first time, the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a home. The idyllic piece of our isolated canyon was a fragile thing, a thin pane of glass waiting to be shattered. Abner knew it. The knowledge was there in the way his eyes constantly scanned the high canyon rims, in the way he would fall silent and listen to the wind, as if trying to decipher a message it carried. The settlers from the town had not forgotten. Their hatred was a patient, simmering thing, a venom that would not dilute with time. Abner understood that their wounded pride, coupled with their festering prejudice, would inevitably lead them to his door. He began to prepare, not with frantic haste, but with the same grim, methodical purpose that defined all his actions. He spent an afternoon reinforcing the heavy wooden door, adding a second, thicker crossbar. He cleaned and oiled his rifle and a formidable-looking shotgun, lining the cartridges up on the mantelpiece beneath my drawing like silent, brass soldiers. He was fortifying our small sanctuary, transforming it from a home into a fortress. Lian watched him, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron, the familiar ghost of fear returning to her eyes. But it was a different fear now, not the passive terror of a victim, but the active dread of someone with something precious to lose. She didn't retreat into herself. She became his shadow, his silent partner in preparation. She took rags and cleaned the shotgun herself, her movements hesitant at first, then more confident as she mimicked the way she had seen him work. She filled every spare bucket and pot with water from the well, creating a reserve inside the cabin. She was no longer just the woman he had saved, she was a defender of this new life they were accidentally building together. The growing tension was a palpable thing, a tightening in the air that made it hard to breathe. One evening, as he stood by the door, staring out into the deepening twilight, I went to him, clutching the smooth stone with its family portrait. "Will they come for us?" I asked, the question a heavy weight in my small chest. He didn't look down at me. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, on the place where the dusty plains met the darkening sky. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was both comforting and immensely sad. "Yes," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble. "They'll come." In that single word, I heard the promise of a coming storm, and the unshakable resolve of the rock that would stand against it. The final evening before the storm broke was unnaturally still. The wind died down completely, and a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the chirping of crickets. The sky to the west was a bruised, purplish-gray, the air thick with the smell of dust and distant, unfallen rain. Inside the cabin, the air was just as charged. We moved around each other in a slow, deliberate ballet of unspoken farewells. Leanne cooked a meal of rabbit stew, and we ate in near silence, the scraping of spoons against the wooden bowls unnervously loud. No one could meet anyone else's eyes. After the meal, as Abner was checking the new bar on the door one last time, my mother did something I had never seen her do before. She went to him, and with a courage that seemed to take all her strength, she reached up and gently touched the scars on his face. "When I saw you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, standing over me, with the same mark. "I thought I was seeing a ghost from my past, come to haunt me." Abner stood rigid, his body as tense as a drawn bowstring. He didn't move, didn't speak, allowing her touch. "But you were not a ghost of the past," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You were a promise of a future." He finally looked down at her, and in his pale, weary eyes, I saw a flicker of something I had never seen before, a raw, vulnerable tenderness. The stone fortress he had built around his heart seemed to crack, just for a moment. He slowly raised his own hand, the one with the cougar's mark, and gently cupped her face. "Leanne," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. It was the first time he had said it aloud. It was in that moment, in that quiet, desperate connection, that they ceased to be two survivors of a shared tragedy. They became two people choosing to stand together against a new one. I watched them from my small cot, my drawing of our stick-figure family clutched to my chest. I finally understood that family wasn't about a shared home or a shared name. It was about shared scars, and the willingness to stand together to keep them from ever being torn open again. The feeling of safety was a fleeting, fragile thing, about to be tested by fire. They appeared with the first, fat drops of rain, emerging from the gloom like apparitions. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally breaking, the sky rent by silent flashes of heat lightning. The mob moved with a grim purpose, their torches sputtering in the increasing drizzle, their faces pale and demonic in the flickering light. They were led by a man named Harker, a brute with a tangled black beard and eyes like chips of obsidian. Abner had been waiting for them, a dark shape at the darkened window, the long barrel of his rifle resting on the sill. The first shot was not his. One of the settlers, emboldened by numbers, fired a pistol wildly, the bullet smacking into the log wall with a loud thwack. That was the signal. The siege began. The air filled with the sounds of chaos, the crack of rifles, the splintering of wood as axes bit into the door, the enraged, guttural shouts of the attackers. Inside, the small cabin was a pocket of intense, focused calm. Abner was a machine. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Each shot was measured, deliberate. He wasted nothing. A cry from the darkness signaled a hit. Mai and I were huddled behind a barricade of furniture Abner had erected, the safest corner of the room. Mai held the heavy shotgun, her face set in a terrifying grimace of fear and resolve. The rain began to fall in earnest now, a torrential downpour that hissed against the hot earth and turned the ground outside into a slick, treacherous morass of mud. The torches of the mob sputtered and died, plunging the canyon into a disorienting cycle of absolute darkness followed by brilliant, instantaneous flashes of lightning. In those strobing moments of light, we could see them, their faces contorted with hate, still coming, still trying to break down the door. The heavy wood groaned under the assault. Harker's voice rose above the din, a roar of pure malice. "Give us the woman, Abner. Give us the foreigner and the brat, and we'll let you live." Abner's only answer was another crack from his rifle, the muzzle flash a brief, angry star in the darkness of the cabin. The fight was a primal, desperate struggle for survival, a tiny island of defiance against a sea of hatred, all under the roaring, indifferent witness of the storm. The door finally gave way with a deafening crash of splintering wood. In a flash of lightning, the doorway was filled with men, their clothes soaked, their faces smeared with mud and rage. Harker was at the front, a massive axe held high. Abner met their charge with a feral roar, abandoning the rifle and grabbing a heavy iron poker from the hearth. He swung it in a vicious arc, clearing the doorway for a precious second. He was no longer a quiet, solitary man, he was a cornered bear, fighting with the last of his strength for his territory, for his family. He was magnificent and terrible. A knife sliced through his sleeve, and he grunted as it laid open his arm, the same arm that bore the old scars. He didn't falter. He brought the poker down on a man's shoulder with a sickening crunch. But there were too many. They poured into the room, a wave of violence that threatened to drown him. He was being pushed back, step by bloody step. From behind the barricade, Leanne rose, the shotgun bucking in her hands. The blast was deafening, a cannon shot in the small space, and the men in the doorway screamed and fell back. But it was only a momentary reprieve. Harker, untouched, lunged forward, his eyes fixed on us. He saw his prize. "There you are," he snarled, shoving Abner aside. Abner stumbled, falling to one knee, his strength finally failing him. Harker raised his axe, a triumphant, ugly grin splitting his face. It was over. All was lost. And then, the canyon itself screamed. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the thunder. It was a new sound, a deep, grinding, liquid roar that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. It grew in volume with terrifying speed, a sound of immense, unstoppable power. The floor of the cabin began to vibrate. Harker paused, his axe held aloft, a look of confusion on his face. Everyone, attacker and defender alike, froze. The sound was a physical presence now, a crushing weight of noise that drowned out everything else. And through the shattered doorway, in another strobing flash of lightning, we saw it. A solid wall of dark, churning water, 10 feet high, filled with rocks and uprooted trees, was roaring down the narrow canyon. The flash flood, born of the torrential rain in the high country, had arrived. It was nature's rage, a force of raw, elemental fury that dwarfed the petty hatred of men. The attackers turned, their faces masks of disbelief and sudden, stark terror. There was nowhere to run. The wave hit the cabin with the force of a locomotive, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of black water, splintering timber, and screams that were swallowed before they could even form. The last thing I saw was Abner, with a final, desperate surge of strength, throwing his body over Leanne and me as the world came crashing down. We survived, somehow. The main force of the flood was deflected by a massive rock outcropping just upstream from the cabin, a quirk of geology that saved our lives. The cabin was torn apart, the walls ripped from their foundations, but the small corner where we huddled, shielded by Abner's body and the barricade of heavy furniture, held just long enough. We awoke choking on mud and water, tangled in the wreckage. The storm had passed. The sun was rising into a sky washed clean, its light glinting on a world remade. The canyon was gone, replaced by a wide, muddy river, the water now placid, littered with the debris of the flood. Of the attackers, there was no sign. They had been erased, washed away, their hatred scoured from the earth. Abner was alive, though badly injured, his body a testament to the violence of the night. We dragged him from the wreckage onto a small patch of high ground, a tiny island in the muddy devastation. We were homeless. We had lost everything. But we were alive, and we were together. We sat there for a long time, the three of us, huddled together for warmth as the sun climbed higher, drying our soaked clothes. We watched the muddy water flow by, carrying away the last remnants of our old lives. The silence was absolute, the profound quiet that follows a great and terrible noise. As the day warmed, Abner stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at me, then at Leanne, a question in his gaze. Leanne simply reached out and took his hand, her small fingers lacing through his. That was all the answer he needed. I looked at the devastation, at the ruin of the only home I had begun to feel safe in. The old, familiar fear began to creep back in. I looked up at Abner, at his bruised and battered face, and asked the question that had become the prayer of my heart. Are we safe now? Abner looked at the river, at the horizon, at the endless, open sky. He then looked down at Leanne, and at me. He squeezed my mother's hand. He reached out his other hand and gently wiped a streak of mud from my cheek. A slow, weary smile touched his lips, a true smile that reached his tired, pale eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "We are," and in that moment, I knew it was true. We were not just survivors. We were a family, forged in violence, baptized by the flood, and ready to walk into the sunlight of a new day. Hey there, partner. What you just witnessed was a story about how the scars of the past don't have to define our future. It's about how sometimes, the most broken people, in the most broken places, can find a way to piece each other back together and become something stronger than they ever were apart. It's a reminder that even when you're facing down a world of hate, sometimes the most powerful force of all is the quiet courage to stand and protect the family you choose. If you believe in that kind of frontier justice, the kind that washes the world clean and starts anew, then make sure you stick with us. We've got another story coming that you're not going to want to miss.